Hey guys, welcome to another video. Today we are doing a series of top 5 rares and mythics from each color to craft from Strixhaven, as well as the Mystic Archive. Some things before we get started. First of all, who am I? If you're new here, you can call me Roxora. I'm a longtime Magic player, as well as a game designer and developer. So I do have that kind of background knowledge in terms of analytics. I have been playing competitively for over 4 years now, going to a variety of big tournaments when we are not in a pandemic. And also, I have been playing on Arena since the closed beta. I got a key fairly early, and so I've well versed in the Arena economy as well as just playing on Arena and dealing with the wildcard system. So some things to note about these lists. Again, these are just my opinions. You might have some disagreements, and I encourage you to discuss that with me. But also, these are general recommendations. The goal of this video is to give you guys some guidance. Again, it can be very daunting when you are just starting out, or if you're not as experienced and there's new cards coming out and you're like, I don't know what to do, I don't know which of these cards are good, I don't know whether it's okay to craft some of these cards, or go after them. So that's the goal of this video. So that goes into my next point, is that these don't take into consideration anything else besides the general recommendation or their general power level. It does not take into consideration what you personally think is fun or what types of decks you particularly like to play. So if you see a lot of control cards in here, and you're an aggro player, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be crafting aggro cards if you really only like to play aggro. So if that's the case, go ahead and do that. But if you are just a general player and you're just not sure what to do, these are for you. The other thing to note is that this set in particular has some dual-sided cards as well as lots of multicolored cards. So it's organized by the color pie, as well as there's going to be a multicolored section. So it might look kind of weird if there's not cards where you expect them to be. Again, just don't worry about it. I just did this by what sites were organizing them by. So just a note there. All right, lastly, what goes into these lists? There's several things that I considered when making these top 5 lists. First of all, rarity. MTG Arena has a wildcard system, if you're not aware already, and wildcards, particularly mythic wildcards, are hard to obtain. Rare wild cards, depending on what kinds of deck you're crafting, can also sometimes be hard to get or in demand. So I take those into consideration when evaluating whether it's okay to craft those cards. So if there's a mythic that's maybe not as good, that's going to be way lower on the list, especially because it is a mythic. All right, next thing is that, are they actually seeing play, or do they have the potential to see play? So I'm looking at lists online and metagame and seeing what cards are seeing play, but also there might be cards that are being held back by certain cards, cough Bone Crusher Giant, or just other cards that have potential but just haven't produced or been seen in a deck list yet. Next up, I would consider how powerful the card is. Is this just kind of a bulk rare that's just kind of being put in a few decks, or is this really a main staple card that is going to be a powerhouse in the format? The other thing is, how universally used are the cards? So is this a combo specific card? Is it used in something like that, or is it something that kind of like Bone Crusher Giant, that is pretty much seeing play in every single deck that is eligible to run it, whether it's in their colors or if it's works with their deck? And then the last thing is, while these are standard cards or standard legal cards, and I'm partially considering them for standard, the other thing that I am taking into consideration here is historic. And if a particular card can see play in both standard and historic, then that card is going to be more desirable. because it is seeing play not just in a variety of decks in one format, but in both of the formats, or the main formats on Arena. That does not count, though, for the Mystic Archive, again, because it does not, it is not legal to play in Standard. Quick thing before we start. So, we will be covering, colorless cards, but we're not going to be covering any lands. But I did want to mention that the dual lands, while these aren't as desirable for Historic, are always a good craft if you are trying to play Standard. So, if you're playing Standard and you are looking to craft this for certain decks, lands are the dual lands. These show lands are always a good choice. I would never say to not craft lands. All right, so we're doing this in Wooburg or order. So we're going to start off with white, and first up for white is Mavinda's Student's Advocate. This is the 2/3 flying that can cast sorceries or instants from your graveyard once per turn. So this can cast cards during your opponent's turn. But it costs 8 more unless it targets a creature you control. So this is looking to be a good card to work with cards like Feather in Historic, and so that's why I have this card in this list here. Is while it's not necessarily seeing play just yet, people are kind of struggling to figure out whether Mavinda or Feather, kind of which one is better or in what numbers. And but I do think that it can also do things in Standard. Boros kind of does have some Magecraft stuff. It does care about spells, and it does also work with some of the cards that we'll talk about in this list as well later. All right, so next up we have Shale, Dean of Radiance, and Embros, Dean of Shadow. So again, this is kind of the weird one where it's a double-sided card, but I'm primarily looking at Shale here. A 2-mana flying vigilance legendary creature, but it has tap, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that entered the battlefield under your control this turn. So this card having vigilance and having this tap ability is really, really effective because you can play it on 2, then attack with it on turn 3, then post combat tap it and post combat cast a creature, maybe even cast 2 if your deck is able to do that, and then you can put a counter on your creature. So really, really good at just being aggressive. Again, flying is also nothing to scoff at. And then the Embro side is kind of similar, where you put a counter on a creature and then deal damage to it, and then it has a built-in card advantage engine into it, where whenever a creature you control with the counter dies, you get to draw a card. So whether you are playing either side or both sides, both of these cards are able to put counters on cards and do things. So while these Shale, I have seen some decks play Shale. I haven't seen as many decks trying to cast the Embro side, but regardless, this card does have a lot of potential. And I think if you're interested in +1/+1 counter decks or aggro decks, I think that would be a worthy craft. All right, next up we have Leonin Lightscribe. All right, next up we have Leonin Lightscribe, which is a 2-mana 2/2 cat cleric that has Magecraft, which says whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. So kind of like Prowess, but for your team. And it has already seen play in both Standard and Historic for kind of spell-based aggro decks. And yeah, it is just a great card. And so if you're interested in playing these types of prowess-based decks, this is absolutely something that you'll probably have to craft at some point. Even more than that, though, is Clever Lumamancer, which is a 1-mana 0/1 human wizard with Magecraft. It gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So this is kind of like super prowess for itself. And again, is already seeing play in both standard and historic for spell-based aggro decks. Even more so. And this particularly being an uncommon is really, really good and a very, very easy craft. So highly recommend using some wildcards on this, which you should probably have because it's an uncommon. And then last but not least, Elite Spellbinder, the Paulo Vitor Dama de Rosa Championship card. 3 mana, 3/1 flying, so kind of Vendilion click stats, and when it enters the battlefield, looks at the opponent's hand, exiles a card from it, and then, exiles a non-land card from it, and then they cannot play the card unless they pay 2 more mana to cast. So while that might not seem like a lot, the effect combined with the decent body that flies has led to it being a pretty much auto-include in a lot of white decks, but particularly taxing hate bear type aggro decks that seek to gain early advantage on the board while also disrupting your opponent through these types of effects. And that is happening again in both standard and historic. So again, highly recommend this. It's just a rare, so really, really good card that is being used in a lot of decks. All right, now on to the blue cards, the so-called best color in Magic, as some people like to say. We got Jadzi Oracle of Arcavios, maybe. Journey to the Oracle. Again, this is kind of weird because it's a Simic card, but most people are playing it for the Jadzi side. So Jadzi is a 8 mana 5/5 human wizard, legendary creature that you can discard a card to return it to your hand, but you also have Magecraft for whenever you cast or copy an instant sorcery, you reveal the top card. If it is a non-land card, you can pay 1 rather than pay its mana cost. Or if it's a land, it just goes right onto the battlefield. It's kind of seeing play as kind of like this, turbo it out as fast as you can, and then use it to cast big stuff for very, very cheap. And the journey side, is kind of designed to help you reach Jadzi, but again, a lot of decks I'm seeing are just using the side for Jadzi. This is a cool card, and it's kind of an interesting build around, but it is a mythic, and it is kind of specific to the Jadzi decks, so that's why it's kind of lower on the list, but it is looking to be a powerful card to build around. So if you like this card, and you like those kinds of interesting combos or interesting archetype or interesting strategies, this is a fine thing to craft, but I would not highly recommend it unless you really, really like this card. Next up, we have Symmetry Mage, which is kind of similar to the Lumamancer. Is a 1 mana 0/2 flying, and when you cast an instant or sorcery, target creature gets base power 2 until end of turn. This can target itself, so if you cast something, it just becomes a 2/2 flying until end of turn, and also can kind of augment the power of your other creatures or reduce the power of your opponent's creatures to a more manageable size. So a lot of uses for this card. It's kind of jokingly called like standard Delver of Secrets, even though it's nowhere near as good as Delver of Secrets, but it is still pretty good. And as an uncommon, this is a good craft. Again, very easy to craft, and again goes in pretty much any deck that would want to hit the board running and cast creatures. Love the art, by the way. All right, next up is multiple choice. This kind of fits epitomizes the motto of being used in a variety of ways or variety of decks. This is not really seeing a lot of play right now, but I think it is a good thing to craft if you like blue decks, because this card has a lot of usage. Can either be used to draw cards, return a creature to the hand, or make a 4/4 elemental, or all of the above, as it says, and is in the theme of the card. There's a lot of usage for the card, and while again it's not seeing play right now, I definitely think that this this card might see usage. I think there's just better options right now, and that's why it's not really seeing play. Next up, we have Test of Talents, which is a 2-mana counterspell for only instants and sorceries, but if it counters the spell, removes all copies from the opponent's deck and hand, and then, has the clause for if you do end up taking a card from their hand, then they get to get some cards back. But this card is, narrow in that it is primarily a anti-control, or anti-spells card that you'd imagine, okay, well, this is probably a sideboard card, right? Well, yes, technically. There have been some people running these main deck, but the reason why I'm saying to craft this card, besides the fact that it's an uncommon and is easy to craft, is the Sultai Ultimatum decks have been running rampant on Arena, and Test of Talents is the way that those decks have been getting countered. This is just straight up an answer to Ultimatum. You counter the Ultimatum with this, and you don't have to worry about it for the rest of the game. So, if you are not, whether you're playing the Ultimatum decks or not, even if you are, this is a good card to craft, because you can just stick these in your sideboard, stick these, one or maybe one in your main deck if you really, really want, and you won't lose as much to the Ultimatum decks, which I know nobody wants to do. And then last but not least, we have Solve the Equation, which is just a Mystical Tutor type effect. Search your library for a card, put it into your hand. This is, really, really powerful in a lot of cases. Again, seen play in Historic, definitely. But also in Standard, even though it's pretty slow, there could definitely be some uses for this card. And I think the thing that earns it the number one slot is that it is an uncommon that is just going to be very powerful. So it kind of hits all the marks of, it's powerful, it sees play in both Standard and Historic, and it can be used in a lot of decks. So it hits all the marks there. All right. Next up, we have Black. Ooh, spooky black. And we have a dual card here for number 5. We have Valentin, Dean of the Vein, and Lisette, Dean of the Root. Mainly, this is for Valentin, which is a 1-mana 1/1 legendary vampire warlock with menace and lifelink, and it is really, really relevant because of the second clause there. It says if a non-token creature an opponent control would die, exile it. It's a 1-mana card that says, all right, all your creatures don't go to the graveyard anymore as long as this card's on the battlefield. That is a pretty strong effect for 1 mana. There is the other text, that makes the pests and stuff. That's kind of fine, but really the reasoning for this is it's a cheap card. This could see play in mono black aggro, just as Valentin, or again, just any deck that wants, to play to the board early, but also kind of have this kind of exile or disruptive effect. I'm not even going to talk about Lisette here. Like, it has gain life and you put counters on your creatures. Cool. But I think Valentin is the card that you kind of are looking for when you're like, do I want to craft this card? All right. Next up, we have a strange one, which is Go Blank. Typically, 3 mana target player discards 2 type cards. Do not really see play and aren't really good, even in limited. But Go Blank here, doing that and then exiling all cards from a player's graveyard. That is really useful because a lot of times the control decks usually have some type of graveyard value plan, whether that's casting spells from their graveyard or buying back cards or whatever it is. Getting to make your opponent discard 2 cards and then get rid of all of the cards in their graveyard has been shown to be very effective against control decks or just mid-range value decks in general. So think about like in Historic, you have Search for Canta. This counters that. Gearhulks, it also counters the Mizzix Mastery decks in Historic. And in Standard, there are tons of creatures that want to be coming back from the graveyard. There's been a lot of reanimation decks. And so Go Blank is kind of a good way to kind of have this card in your sideboard or in your main, one or two in your main deck that disrupts your opponents, but also can get some card advantage going. So good uncommon to craft. Next up, we have the staple mythic Professor Onyx, aka Liliana, who's a professor now for some reason. I don't know. This is in here primarily just because, again, it's the mythic of the set. It's just powerful. It's only 3 on here because it's not really seeing play right now, and it is a mythic, so it's expensive to craft. And also, even so, like, your deck's probably only going to run 1 or 2 of these. I don't see any decks really running 4 copies of this card and being competitive. But it does have some cool effects on it. Again, the Magecraft part of the card is pretty powerful, as I've seen. So yeah, if you like Liliana type cards, this is an interesting card to craft and build around potentially. All right, now on to the actual really great cards. We have Baleful Mastery, which can be a 4 mana exile for a creature or planeswalker, or it can be cast for 2 mana, but your opponent gets to draw a card. So this can be really good in a lot of instances. Can be a cheap removal spell, even though it kind of nets your opponent a card. But if you can cast this, it's flexible because if you're just able to cast it for 4 mana, then there is no more of that downside. So this is already seeing play in a lot of decks. Again, it's not really like a 4-of, so like it's probably just like 1 or 2. It's also seeing play in both standard and historic, so highly recommend picking up 1 or 2 copies of this card and using it in some of your decks. And then, of course, I think everyone saw this coming. We have Senchmore, which is essentially Young Pyromancer. It's 3 mana for 3/2 menace with Ward. Ward essentially protects your creatures from spells unless they pay the cost, in this case, 3 life. And then we have Magecraft, which whenever you cast or copy a spell, you make a 1/1 pest. There's a lot of text on this card. This card does a lot of things. But yeah, it is seeing play both in standard and historic, acting as another copy of Young Pyromancer in the red-black decks. It's also just seeing play in standard with just playing this in the sacrifice decks, or just any deck that has black and cast spells. Like this card is very good. So I would absolutely recommend taking a look at Senchmore Witch and building some decks around it. All right, next up, my favorite, Red. Got some aggressive cards, maybe. We got Blarg, Dean of Chaos, or Augusta, Dean of Order, at number 5, mainly for the Blarg side. 2 mana, 2/2 legendary Orc Shaman that can tap to Rummage, discard a card, draw a card, or you can pay 5 to essentially Cascade for a non-legendary card with mana value 3 or less. So if you're out of cards in hand and you don't feel like rummaging, then you can just use this and get a creature potentially. I think you're guaranteed to get a creature. It is non-legendary, so that is kind of restrictive. So that's kind of why it's down on this list. And both sides of these cards just kind of seem underwhelming. Like there might be some decks that want Blarg, but I feel like Augusta is actually kind of the more relevant card because of the augmented stats. But you never know. But I think this card has a lot of different ways that it can be used, and that's why it's on the list. But I would not craft this card too highly. I would look at some of these other cards more. And next up we have Flame Scroll Celebrant and Revel in Silence. This is much more kind of realistic, oddly enough, even though it doesn't look as flashy. So the front side is a 2 mana 2/1 that deals your opponent damage whenever they use something that's not a mana ability. And then it also has a type of fire breathing effect. That's not the main way this card is being used, though. It's actually used for the second half, which is Revel in Silence. I know this is the white side of the card, but just bear with me here. says your opponent can't cast spells or activate planeswalk abilities this turn, and then you exile it. So you play it mostly, in some type of Boros, aggro or creature-based deck. And Revel in Silence can counter the Ultimatum decks, can counter any decks that might give you trouble. So you can cast this on the upkeep of your opponent's turn if you think they're going to cast a Wrath effect, or you can cast this before you want to resolve a really important spell on your turn, and your opponent is kind of backed into a corner. So the silence part of this card is what makes this card more playable. But you don't just play it for the Revel in Silence half. Again, you're planning on using it with the Flamescroll Celebrant in addition. So interesting card, again, being used in both standard and historic. So if you're interested in Boros decks, this might be a card to look at. Next up, we have probably my least favorite card because I just hate the math. But we have got Crackle with Power, which is triple X and double red for a sorcery that says Crackle with Power deals 5 times X damage to each of up to X targets. Oh god. So, this is essentially 5 mana, deal 5 to one thing. 8 mana, deal 10 damage to 2 things. Or 11 mana, deal 15 damage to 3 things. I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to, do anything past that. So, this is seen in decks that can produce a lot of mana. But it also is kind of just being used for, these kind of late game decks as a 5 mana deal 5. If you can cast this for 8 mana, I think that it's pretty good value. Again, dealing 10 to your opponent and dealing 10 to a creature seems like a pretty good deal to me. But yeah, I don't particularly like this card, but I have seen it being used in a variety of decks. But also keep in mind that it's also a mythic. Keep that in mind, but this is an interesting card, and it's something to keep an eye on. Next up, one of the more playable cards in red is Draconic Intervention. As an additional cost to cast it, you get to exile a instant or sorcery from your graveyard, then it deals X damage to each non-dragon creature, where X is that card's mana value, and if any creature would die, it gets exiled, and then Draconic Intervention gets removed from the game. So this is already seeing play in a lot of spell-based dragon decks. There are the legendary dragons in the set that all kind of work well with this card. You can play your dragons and then play some spells. This also works really, really well in Izzet decks. So board wipes, particularly one-sided board wipes, are not common, and if you can make this work that way, then this card's going to do a lot of work for you. So number 2 here, but number 1 is a little bit better. But it is an interesting card to look at. Some of you might not be expecting number 1, and that is Grinning Ignis. I know, right? Wait, how is this card worse than this card? Well, the answer is we have Burgi, which is the legend from the previous set that whenever you cast a spell, produces a red mana. So this combined with Burgi allows you to just cast this card over and over and over, and potentially produce some type of infinite value. That can be done in both standard and historic. In historic, it's being used with the combination of Hazardous Monument as well as I'm forgetting the name of the card, but it's being used with the Storm cards as well to essentially just combo kill your opponent in Mono Red Storm, and is also being used in standard with some of the any enter the battlefield effects or life gain effects to go infinite. So Grinning Ignis is really good in those decks, and it's only an uncommon. So I would suggest, if you have the other cards for those decks, definitely craft this card. Again, very, very cheap. And so you can just quickly, put this in your decks and go and combo people out. It's been a while since there's been some type of effect like this of returning a creature to your hand and making mana. And I don't think it went very well because I think, people are not going to enjoy this. I mean, it's not a big problem, but I think it is kind of crazy that we have this card now. All right, moving on to green, our last of the 5-color pie here. First up, we have Blex Vexing Pex / Search for Blex. So Blex is the legendary kind of pest synergy card, 3-mana 3/2 legendary, and other pests, bats, insects, snakes, and spiders, oh my, get +1/+1, and then if it dies, you gain 4 life. And then there's the other side, which allows you to put any number of the top 5 cards in your hand and lose 3 life. So kind of synergizing with the life gain aspect of pests. But yeah, this card isn't seeing a lot of play just yet, but if there is a pest type deck that sees play, or maybe a use for Search for Blex, then this is an interesting card, but it's a mythic, and again, it's not seeing play right now, so that's why it's number 5. All right. Next up, we have a good sideboard card in Containment Breach, which is a lesson which says destroy target artifact or enchantment. If its mana value is 2 or less, create a pest. So this is primarily here for the learn or lesson mechanic. Being able to grab this from your sideboard whenever you learn is really valuable. Again, green loves to be able to deal with artifacts and enchantments, and being able to do so in game 1, and without having to sideboard cards as well, and essentially being able to tutor for it is powerful. So if you're playing lessons or you're playing learn mechanic cards, then this is a card to craft. Next up is a card that I've been playing a lot in Limited, and I think it has shown me that it is powerful enough to be considered in decks. I'm not putting this here as like oh yeah, you should put this in all of your decks, but I do think that this card has potential in Standard, and that is Emergent Sequence. It is a rampant growth that puts a land onto the battlefield, and then makes that land become a 0/0 blue fractal and gets counters for each land that entered this turn. So the reason why I think this card is good is because ramp is already good in green, but then also just being able to produce a creature to do things with, even though you don't get that creature for the turn, can sometimes help these ramp decks play to the board while also advancing their mana game plan. So the way this, the typical play pattern with this deck works is you play on turn 2, you play your land, and then you play Emergent Sequence. And now you have a 2/2, fractal, in addition to another land. In multiples, this gets even better, where if on turn 4 you play a land, play Emergent Sequence, then another Emergent Sequence, you get a 2/2 and a 3/3. So, as well as 2 lands, obviously. So, that's just those, that card in isolation. But now if you think about it in terms of synergizing with the fractals in this set, I think, there's a lot of potential here. So I think this card's really interesting. Rampant growths are, 2-mana rampant growth have previously, been absent from Standard. I think this card's pretty good. So I think it's worth looking at in Standard. All right, next up we have Narled Professor, more traditional kind of rare here. 4-mana 5/4, already great stats, and then when it enters the battlefield, you learn. So again, this is good with some of the lesson cards that we've seen. So the Containment Breach. So this can go and grab that, and there's also just a 4-mana 5/4. So yeah, I'm not sure what else to say. It just seems like it has the potential. Again, not seeing play right now, but if there's ever a learn deck or a green aggro deck that wants to have some type of sideboard card, Narled Professor is looking to be quite the card. And then last but not least, at number 1 here, we have Dragon's Guard Elite. 2 mana, 2/2, and with Magecraft, which gives it counters. And then you can play 6 mana to double the number of counters. Not really playing it for that effect, obviously, but just a 2/2 that gets bigger whenever you cast spells is already seeing play in both Standard and Historic, as a spell synergy card. So yeah, if you're interested in spell-based decks and you prefer the color green, as opposed to maybe like Izzet cards, this is a card to look at because it is seeing an interesting amount of play. All right, next up we have the artifact or colorless cards. First off, I'm just gonna put this here and suggest any of the kind of seemingly janky lessons that are not as good. So Introduction to Annihilation isn't very good, but again, these are really easy to craft. And if you want to build lesson decks, even though they're not seeing play, again, if you enjoy that mechanic or want to explore the new mechanics, I would craft some of these. But this does not apply to number 4, which is the good lessons, which are Environmental Science and Introduction to Prophecy. I've been very impressed with these cards in Draft, and if there is a lesson deck to be played in Standard, then these should absolutely be in there. Environmental Sciences, getting you a land and gaining you 2 life is fantastic. Introduction to Prophecy, scrying 2, then drawing a card is also fantastic. So you might not need both of these in your deck. You might need one or the other, or both. It depends on your deck. Again, if you don't want to be drawing that many lands, Introduction to Prophecy might be a better card. But both of these cards are really good for the lesson mechanic. All right, on to kind of more of the actual cards. We have Letter of Acceptance, which is a 3 mana rock and can pay 2 mana to sack it to draw a card. So kind of like a bad Commander Sphere, to be honest. And I know I'm kind of calling the card bad as I'm saying you should craft it, but I think this card has some potential. Again, there are some decks that want a 3 mana rock, whether it's for mana fixing, and then being able to cash this in for something else is pretty good. So I don't think it's that good. I don't think it's that powerful, but it is a potential card to consider if you're in that kind of deck. On to the more actual rares here that are going to see play. We have Wandering Archaic, and Explore the Vast Lands. So reading, Wandering Archaic and saying, okay, whenever your opponent casts a spell, they have to pay 2 more. If they don't, get to copy it. Holy moly. So, essentially saying, yes, your opponent's spells cost 2 more. Because, boy, if they ever let you copy the spell, that's going to be insane. And then, the Explore the Vast Lands, you can read it. It's kind of not the reason to play the card. Again, the primary reason to play this card is for the Archaic. I'm not exactly sure what deck this would go into. So far, this has seen 0 play, but it is a very powerful card. It might not even see play in Standard or Historic. It might see play in Brawl, but in either case, I do think this card is worth looking at. Whether it's in the actual constructed formats or in Brawl. And again, a lot of people have been talking about this card in Commander, but I do think that it can do other things potentially. We'll see. All right, and then of course, I think most people would have seen this coming if you assumed that this was the card that would be in artifacts and not in multicolored, because it does have the multicolored identity. But we got Cody, vociferous Codex here. Oh boy, that is a mouthful. 3 mana 1/4 artifact creature construct, and you can't cast permanent spells when it's on the battlefield. Wait, what? Nah, just kidding. But it has the cool ability to pay for mana and then add Wooburg to the mana pool, and then if you cast your next spell, you essentially cascade for a instant or sorcery. And then just cast that card for free. So this could be seeing play in a lot of spell-based decks so far. Again, it hasn't seen play, but this is a really fun build around. So if you like this card, I would recommend crafting it. Again, these two are kind of, close to each other in that, again, they're not seeing play, but Cody, I think, has the potential to be so much fun and really powerful if you can get past the initial kind of deck building restriction of not really running any other permanents other than maybe Cody. All right, now we are moving on to the multicolored cards. So the some of the cards that you were expecting to be in some of these colors are you haven't seen yet. They might be here. So quick, with an honorable mention is Silver Quill Command. So a lot of the commands are in here. This one didn't quite make the cut for me. It hasn't really seen play. I still think it's good. I still think it's going to see play. It just hasn't seen the same type of success that I would usually expect to see from this card. But definitely keep an eye on it. And if you really like Orzhov decks, Silver Quill decks, then go ahead and craft this card if you'd like. All right, first up at number 5 is Lorehold Command, making a 3/2, giving your creatures indestructible, essentially casting a lightning helix or sacking something to draw 2 cards. Getting to choose 2 of these has proven to be pretty effective, really good in a lot of Boros decks that are trying to be aggressive, using it to give your stuff indestructible and then, ping something for 3, or even, kind of refill your hand by drawing 2 cards. Has already seen play both in standard and historic, so really good craft if you are interested in Lorehold. Next up, we have Galazetterizmari, the first Elder Dragon, which is 4 mana for a 3/4 legendary Elder Dragon. It's got flying, and when it enters, you make a treasure. And artifacts have tap, add 1 mana of any color, and that is to only be cast on instants and sorceries. So you essentially have mana rocks for spells. So it's kind of like a spell and artifact synergy card, and it synergizes with the spells in Prismari that discard to make treasures. So this card is already seeing play in standard, not as much in historic, but it still could. So you never know, and is really being dominant in some of those decks. So if you're looking to, experiment with some new decks and that are maybe a little bit more powerful, a little bit more competitive, Galazeth is something to look at. Next up, we have another command, the Prismari command. Of course, the Is It one is great. Getting to shock something, getting to essentially cast Faithless Looting, make a treasure or destroy an artifact. And as we've already seen, the treasure aspect of this card is fairly relevant, but also is just very flexible. Getting artifact removal main deck as well is very nice, as I've seen with this card. I've been playing this card a lot. This card is higher than Galazeth, primarily because it's seeing play in non-Galazeth decks. It's seeing play in a ton of decks, both in standard and historic, and is just very flexible of a card. So definitely craft this card if you're interested in Prismari or Is It decks. Next up, we have the rare kind of removal spell of the set, that is Vanishing Verse. For Orzhov, you can just exile, target mono-colored permanent. Yes, that's right, permanent. So this can exile planeswalkers, this can exile enchantments, can exile anything that is mono-colored. And so it is really effective in so many decks, in both standard and historic. I don't think we've seen something so effective. Again, I wouldn't play 4 of these. I would probably play something to the effect of 2, maybe having some in your sideboard, just in case. But Vanishing Verse, when it hits something, when it hits its target, is fantastic. So if you're looking to play some kind of removal, or if your deck needs it, this might be something to look at. And then last, but most certainly not least, we have Villamagus Lorehold at number 1 here. I think everybody kind of saw this coming if you are paying attention to standard or historic right now. 5 and red and white for a 5/5 legendary Elder Dragon, flying, vigilance, haste. We don't really care about any other aspect of the card besides haste, because when it attacks, you look at the top 7 and you get to cast a instant sorcery for free as long as its mana cost is less than or equal to its power. So this card is seeing a ton of play in both standard and historic, being used to cast Time Walk or Time Warp. Time Warp is the 5 mana extra turn spell. It's being used to cast Lorehold Command. So this card is doing, and I'm planning on showing some fun decks with it in standard. So not particularly the card that we usually expect to be like the best. Like usually, like the 7 mana Boros Dragon is not that impressive, but it has definitely shown to be a powerful card. So yeah, absolutely. There's so many things to do with this card, and even in all of those decks, it is very powerful. It is essentially a must kill. Yeah. What an insane card. All right. With all of that done, I want to take a quick look at the Mystic Archive. So if you're not aware, these are alternative art reprint cards. Most of them are not legal in standard. Some of them are, I believe, but most of them aren't. So we're mostly going to be talking about these cards in terms of historic. These are present in draft, so if you see them in draft, it's good to know whether to pick them up or not. But some of them are also not legal in historic. So, for example, Lightning Bolt, Demonic Tutor, Counterspell, those type of cards we're not going to be talking about either, because those are not legal in either standard or historic. Real quick mention, give a shout out to any of the uncommons. I have Shock up here, but there's also Claim the Firstborn. There's also Negate. There's Duress. They all have alternative arts, and they're all uncommons. So if you don't have these cards, or if you really like the art, so I really like Shock here, go ahead and give these cards a craft. Again, it's just uncommons. And put them in your deck. Yeah. So first up, we have Faithless Looting. This might be lower on the list for what most people would expect, because a lot of people were scared of Faithless Looting when it first came out, and it has shown to be a little powerful. It is good. There are decks that use it, but it has not been the insane card that a lot of people expected it to be. It has made Izzet Phoenix a little bit better, but it's not like every single deck is all of a sudden rushing. I think the Grixis or the Rakdos Arcanist decks are not even running it. There's a lot of decks that could be running it that just are choosing not to. So, the card is still good, right? So again, if you're playing Izzet Phoenix, if you're playing other kinds of decks and want to experiment with Faithless Looting decks, this card is maybe not the best right now, but has the potential to be good. Also, it's number 5 on here because what is this art? All right, moving on to number 4, and that is Lightning Helix. We don't have Lightning Bolt, we have Lightning Helix for some reason. And dealing 3 and gaining 3, being able to deal damage to the face. This card is being used in a variety of ways, both in burn decks as well as control decks, either Jeskai control decks for the most part, or there are some Boros control decks, kind of, I guess, or mid-range. So this is seeing a lot of play in a variety of archetypes, aggro control and mid-range, all of the above. So really good card for historic. All right, spoiler alert, the last 3 cards are all blue. Number 3 on the list is Brainstorm. I know a lot of people might be expecting this to be number 1, and while this card is very powerful, in Legacy and Vintage, this card is not as good in Historic because we don't have access to the same type of shuffling effects with the fetch lands that we normally would. We do still have Fabled Passage, but we only get 4 of those. And so that's kind of why Brainstorm is lower on this list, because if you can build your mana base to include Fabled Passage and run Brainstorm, then you actually should. But there are a lot of decks out there that are not running Brainstorm in blue. This still is good, but it is a rare. That's the unfortunate part with a lot of these Mystic Archive cards, is they are upshifted to rares. So they're going to be a little bit hard to get. But if you're playing Historic and you're playing a blue deck and your deck is running Fabled Passage, I would highly suggest crafting some Brainstorms and playing with this crazy card. On to the next one, which is Time Warp, which is a mythic, but again, as we talked about earlier, with the Lorehold Elder Dragon, Time Warp is doing a bunch of crazy stuff in Historic, not just with that card, but with just taking turns decks in general, using Narset and Teferis and things to, or Tameo, to find Time Warp and kind of loop it over and over. That this card is kind of bringing back the extra turn decks that were previously killed by bans. So now they're back and kind of almost better than ever, thanks to this edition. So if you enjoy taking turns and essentially ruining fun for your opponent, Time Warp is the card for you. Or if you really like the Elder Dragon decks that are showing up, this card is seeing the play in those. So, and then last but not least, Memory Lapse. Again, looks pretty unassuming. You get to counter a spell, but instead of putting it into the graveyard, it goes onto the top. But this card is seeing play in a lot of decks, and I mean a lot. Essentially, every single control deck in the format is playing this card, either at 3 or 4 copies. The Jeskai control deck, the blue-red control deck, the Magma Opus decks, even the Sultai Ultimatum decks are running this as some type of disruption. Dimir Rogues, this card is actually the best at its best in Dimir Rogues, because you put the card on top and then you attack with your Rogues and it mills the card over, getting rid of it permanently. So this card is, while we don't have Counterspell in Historic, this card is almost kind of acting as Counterspell, or a more balanced version of Counterspell. So if you are playing in Historic and you are you've got some blue decks that want Counterspells, this is absolutely must craft. Sorry to say, but I bit the bullet. I was playing some decks that kind of would run this card, and I just needed it. Really interesting addition to Historic in Memory Lapse, but I think it is a cool include, and definitely requires a lot of skill to play. All right, that is going to do it for the top 5 rares and mythics to craft from Strixhaven. What did you guys think? Do you guys agree with me on a lot of these things, or am I am I stupid and apparently missing some cards, forgetting some things, or just have things in the complete wrong order? Let me know in the comments below. And if you made it to the end of this video, please leave a like and subscribe. I do a lot of MTG Arena content on this video, on this channel, and doing lots of videos from deck text to drafting, all aspects of Arena. And you can also catch me live at twitch.tv/Roxora098. Link will also be in the description. I play, again, a lot of Magic the Gathering, but I play a variety of games as well. My favorite game is actually Kingdom Hearts, but I also play some League, some Valorant, all sorts of stuff. Leave me a follow there, and you can catch me live. Again, I hope this video was helpful to you, and I hope you guys are excited to go out and craft some cards and play with Strixhaven. All right, guys, I will see you guys for the next video.